Let's start this daily update with a key point that could shake up the markets tomorrow. Because if the Supreme Court, which we've been talking about for quite a few days now, declares the tariffs imposed by Donald Trump illegal, the United States could be forced to reimburse more than $200 billion to importers. In other words, it would be a pretty massive budgetary shock, because what you need to know is that these tariffs have brought in massive amounts of money to the US Treasury. And having to give it back, that money being returned would mean suddenly pulling a portion of the liquidity out of the economy. It's exactly the kind of event that can create immediate stress on the markets. So we're not just dealing with a purely legal issue here. It's a direct test, in fact, to gauge the strength, or at least to test the strength of the current economic model. So stay tuned. I'll talk to you about it in the daily update. And precisely to understand a bit more and better grasp the magnitude of what's at stake with this Supreme Court decision, you need to look at this graph. I'll show it to you and zoom out here. It shows us in black and white that the probability of the Supreme Court upholding Donald Trump's tariffs has literally, and I mean literally, collapsed to around 29%. So in other words, the market is already clearly pricing in a scenario that's unfavorable to Donald Trump. That is to say, they're already anticipating this decision. And this gradual drop in pricing over the past several months reflects a loss of confidence that is simply massive, because right now the market just doesn't believe in it anymore. And it's not surprising, especially when you listen to what Trump himself has said, because according to him, if the Supreme Court overturns his tariffs, it could undo trillions in investments that have been tied to these taxes since 2022. He even calls it a complete mess, which in economic terms, I'm not giving the literal translation, means a potential liquidity shock for the country. Where we have a market, in fact, that fears a decision with serious consequences. We also have tariffs, and if they are removed, it's not just a political issue, it's simply an enormous budget hole. There could also be pressure on the dollar or simply an adjustment in the profit margins of importing companies. And as a result, what you need to know is that this can have an immediate impact on risk markets, including the crypto market. So this decision simply becomes a catalyst, a huge one, even potentially causing major volatility when the decision is made. And maybe the market has already priced in, as I was saying, this particular scenario. And in that case, the drop won't be as brutal. But if the opposite scenario were to happen, and in the end, the Supreme Court actually rules in favor of the tariffs, then we could see an explosive upward move that, in my opinion, would surprise quite a few people. There's also another important update regarding crypto regulation in the United States. It was supposed to be announced on January 15th. There were a few delays because, in fact, the Senate ultimately decided to postpone what's called the markup of the crypto market structure bill to the end of January. It was supposed to be mid-January, but it was pushed back to the end of the month. So officially, the goal is to get more bipartisan support, which is actually a good sign because it means that negotiations are still ongoing and there is a real chance of reaching an agreement. In a rather unique context, it's important to understand one thing clearly. When a bill is buried, it isn't postponed. It simply disappears from the agenda. And here we're talking about a strategic delay, not an abandonment. So Washington is simply trying to secure as many votes as possible to avoid a fragile transition that could lead to a rejection. And so the dynamic remains constructive here regarding this famous markup, and American regulators are making progress. And even if it's not as fast as some had hoped, the trajectory hasn't changed. So the structure of the crypto market in the United States is taking shape precisely with this famous markup. And each step brings us a little closer. Crypto to a slightly clearer, more transparent, and above all, more institutionalized framework. And while the United States is taking its time with regulation, there's also another country that has just made a pretty huge move, South Korea, because it is officially putting an end to its famous crypto ban after 9 years of prohibition. And this is a major turning point because we're talking about a country that is ultra connected with a population that is very crypto savvy, native, and yet has been kept out of the market since 2017, at least on the institutional side. And so the South Korean regulator now allows listed companies and professional investors to trade cryptocurrencies again. And companies will even be able to allocate up to 5% of their capital to the 20 largest tokens, the biggest projects on the market. And to give you an idea, this potentially represents tens of millions.